Corporate Board Member presents an informational webcast. On this edition, Enterprise Risk Oversight, Do's and Don'ts for Directors, with T.K. Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and Henry Klehm III, Partner, Jones Day.
Welcome to Corporate Board Members Informational Webinar. Today we're going to talk about Enterprise Risk Oversight, the Do's and Don'ts for Directors. And it's my pleasure to welcome my guest for this, Henry Klehm, who is the partner with Jones Day. And Henry, ERM is a topic that sort of gets taken in its totality, okay? And it's sort of discussed in a broad sense. But my real question to you is, as a legal matter, is there any rules around ERM that it has to conform to the COSO guidelines? And then are there any legal requirements for ERM programs?
Well, the COSO definition of enterprise risk management is, by its own terms, intentionally very broad. And in many ways, it goes much further than any legal obligation that would be imposed on a public company or a board member. The basic legal requirements come from basically state law, Delaware corporate law duties around the duty of loyalty and the duty of oversight. But beyond that, there's no firm legal basis to say you have to have a broad risk management program. Although many companies have adopted them as a matter of good practice or best practice, in fact, there's not a significant legal requirement to have a comprehensive risk management program. So
how about, we're going to have a lot of our viewers out there as board members. What is the role of the board as far as the ERM process goes?
Well, it's like any role of the board member. It's an oversight process. The board should own the oversight of the information gathering and reporting system that's in place to report on the risks that the company faces. It's not that the board should ever own the process itself. That's management's job. I've seen disclosures where companies say that our board owns risk management. I think that's not the best way to go. The board's responsibility is oversight, and there's no need as a practical or a legal matter for the board to really take on that extra duty of management, of designing and implementing the system where the law doesn't require it. That's management's job.
Well, directors are nose in, fingers out, right?
Right, exactly.
So what are the common characteristics of a good ERM program? How does one know that right, as a director, that right, these are good characteristics?
Well, it's like any business process. There needs to be a good process around it. There needs to be a good process for developing what are the critical risks facing the company, an agreement on a clear framework for how the company is going to manage those risks, who's going to be responsible within management for each of the key risks and mitigating those risks for the enterprise, and also a vocabulary. In some of my other experiences, I've frequently seen places where somebody, in a far off land thinks something is high risk because it's important to them that day. But on the same time, at the board level, high risk is very different. What's going to be a high risk for the enterprise overall is very different from what somebody sees out in a remote operation. So it's very important to have that basic vocabulary agreed, an agreement on understanding what's going to be high risk for the company overall, and that everybody in the system that's using the system engages in that same vocabulary and uses that same vocabulary so somebody doesn't get it wrong and say something's high risk or low risk, when in fact, at an enterprise level, it may be.
Yeah. How about if we flip that around and say, okay, these are the characteristics of a successful one. Now let's flip it and say, what are the things that practices that boards should avoid?
Right. Well, the first thing is, I think, failing to coordinate the responsibilities at the board level. Audit committees, compensation committees, governance committees, or investment or risk management or whatever other committees you have should make sure that their charters are aligned to make sure that each one understands what risks it's responsible for and who has the overall broader risk oversight. And then how does that all report up to the rest of the director level? Secondly, the other thing that I see a lot is careless communications around ERM. Whether it's a very junior internal auditor who thinks he's found something and concludes that such and such conduct is in a gross violation of the law, or all the way up to the board level, seeing communications about risks that are really not appropriate to put into emails, that are better discussed. Those kinds of things are critical. Secondly, or thirdly, I guess, it's important for boards to understand that there are very few communications around enterprise risk management that are actually going to be privileged communications. Only those about real legal risks, the real risks of things like violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or violations of health and safety, those kinds of things. Those are going to be the only legal issues that are going to be privileged. So the rest of those communications are not. And then the last thing that I see that sometimes I find very disappointing is that sometimes people think that enterprise risk management means the risk is eliminated. And any system of risk management or compliance or anything is never going to eliminate those risks. It should simply give the board a better feel for what the level of risk is within the company and what steps are being taken to mitigate those risks and reduce the risk of loss as a result of when those risks go sour.
Any tips on what directors can do to sort of avoid those problems that you just identified?
Well, the first one is manage the records and make sure the company is managing the records. You know, many times companies have document retention policies and things like that, but they aren't pushed by their boards to make sure they're complying with those. Because keeping communications around enterprise risk management or many of these other things typically does not ultimately inure to the benefit of the company. Occasionally it does, but not always. Secondly, I think it's important to make sure that the risk disclosure that is in the company's peer annual report with the SEC is mapped back to what are those risk factors, how are they managed within the company, what committee owns them, who within management owns them, what are the key issues, and then finally, a very critical practice is making sure there's follow-up on things that are defined as high-risk issues or where there are gaps. So if you identify a gap, it's the board's responsibility to make sure that management is following up that gap, closing that gap, or narrowing it by putting in existing mitigating controls, by establishing mitigating controls.
You know, we've always wondered whether risk is not new. I mean, risk has been in every business since the beginning of time.
Right.
I mean, it's all about risk and reward. This has been managed. Maybe it hadn't been managed appropriately. Mm-hmm. But you often worry now whether risk has gotten too much attention.
Right.
Okay, and the fact that we've tried to take it out of the normal business planning of what happens in the corporation, and
right.
It can't be taken out.
Right.
It's part of the fabric of saying this is the risk we're going to take, and this is what we hope the reward would be.
Right.
Now, certainly all the attention has been brought to this, but when you look out, you know, sort of in the future, how do you feel about, you know, the direction of where we're going with risk and the regulation and stuff? Does that give you comfort or does it give you concern?
Well, I guess part of that begins with the financial services regulators. They have pushed financial institutions in the wake of the financial crisis to adopt very complex and intricate and detailed risk management systems. But in the end, it has to be a reasonable system that matches the business. And there's no one-size-fits-all in this, like any compliance system, any business process. And the risk, I think, for risk management going forward is that people begin to think that because financial institutions are forced to do it by their regulators, that they need to have these comprehensive risk management systems that are designed to detail every risk that they take and document every control that's in place. And create a false sense of security. Because going back to one of the points I made earlier, this is management of risk. It has to be reasonable management of risk. You can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to mitigate a $5 risk. Is that really reasonable? It's not ultimately in anybody's best interest to do that, not in the shareholders' best interest, not in the rest of the public constituency's best interest for companies to do that. It's about making that assessment. Now, it's important to understand, though, that that doesn't really apply and extend to what I would call legal risk management, right? Because no company is ever really going to, no legitimate company, is ever going to really say to management, it's okay if you engage in an illegal act, right? Nobody's going to delegate that responsibility to management. So that's not a risk that anybody is talking about here. Those other risks are those risks that follow around strategy, around all the other things that the corporate business process is involved in. But legal risks, there should be zero tolerance at the board level. Ultimately, again, though, it becomes a matter of balancing what's the cost and what's the benefit.
Yeah, it is interesting to note that the other does dominate over the legal, even though the legal, as you said, should be a zero tolerance.
Right.
I'm sure that we'll, as this evolves, we'll hear more about that, and maybe sometime we'll have to have you back and see what phase 2 is
Right.
on legal risks and see how that has evolved. So, Henry, thanks for joining us and giving us an update on ERM Oversight. And again, we'll look forward to having you back for another one.
Thanks very
another
much, TK.
session. And that will conclude our informational webcast. We hope you'll join us again for one in the future where we'll take a look at another key issue and how that makes you a better board member and a better committee member. So thanks for joining us.
Henry Klehm III can be reached at hclem@jonesday.com. This has been a presentation of Corporate Board Member, an NYSE Euronext company.